We're dedicating much of this show to the breaking news, the death of Fidel Castro.
We want you to look at the contrasting scenes overnight. Right there on the streets of Miami, you can see jubilation. Members of the Cuban community, many of them exiles who fled Castro's repressive regime, celebrating in the streets. Meantime, in Havana, the Cuban capital, the streets quiet and empty.
Fidel Castro was a towering figure in both a physical and a historical sense, and a controversial one in pretty much every sense. He tried to create romance around his revolution with his signature look and his sweeping, often anti-American oratory, but he was also a tyrant whose people have fled by the thousands on rickety and overloaded boats.
Castro also a persistent thorn in the side of the United States, a man who helped bring the world to the precipice of nuclear confrontation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His death comes at a very delicate moment. President Obama has recently moved to normalize relations with Cuba. However, incoming President Donald Trump has threatened to overturn those actions.
We have team coverage this morning with our reporters and analysts standing by, but we start here with ABC's Jim Avila in L.A. Jim, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan. The cigar-chomping, bearded firebrand who once gave a 7-hour speech is silenced this morning. Fidel Castro survived multiple assassination attempts by the U.S. government, but went quietly overnight after nearly a decade of failing health.
Querido pueblo de Cuba.
Fidel's brother, President Raul Castro, announcing the death of his older brother on state television, ending the broadcast echoing that infamous revolutionary slogan.
Hasta la victoria, siempre.
Castro remained skeptical and suspicious of the U.S. right up to his death, defiantly commenting after President Obama's historic visit that Cuba will never forget the Bay of Pigs invasion and does not need America.
I am a communist, a Marxist socialist communist. I am not afraid to say I am a communist.
Fidel Castro was born in 1926 out of wedlock to a wealthy Cuban landowner and his maid. He went to Catholic schools and then studied law. His two passions were baseball. He was very good at it, and politics. He became an activist for the poor and working class. In 1956, after being expelled by Cuba's American-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista, Castro returned secretly with his brother Raul to wage a guerrilla war, seizing power in 1959.
The road to Havana paved with glory for rebel chieftain Fidel Castro.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, just elected, approved the CIA-trained invasion force of 1,300 Cuban exiles who went ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Castro demolished them, a huge propaganda victory. In 1962, American spy planes discovered Castro had let the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close.
Ultimately, the Soviets removed the missiles. Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare and in education. But the inefficiency of Cuba's Soviet-style economy produced dissent. In 1980, more than 125,000 Cubans, some expelled, many allowed to just leave, braved rough seas and dehydration to come to the United States in the Mariel boat lift. In the early 1990s, the fall of the USSR cost Cuba billions of dollars in Soviet aid and trade, leading to widespread shortages and rationing. In 2006, just before intestinal surgery, he gave up power temporarily to his younger brother Raul. He never took the reins again, made it official in 2008. Then suddenly, in the summer of 2010, he began displaying his indomitable drive again in public, giving TV interviews, laying flowers at the tomb of the fallen, exhorting the communist youth, and addressing the Cuban parliament. After nearly 5 decades in power, filled with revolution, defiance, and strife, Castro did live to see the Cuban flag raised at the U.S. Embassy in 2015, and an influx of American tourists, sports teams, and rock concerts. The memorial will be what you might expect for a man who changed Cuban history and dominated the island for more than 50 years. He'll be cremated today, so the body will not be lying in state. Instead, Castro will be memorialized by millions, first in Havana, where the crowds will be asked to sign a loyalty to the revolution oath. And then his ashes will tour the island before burial in his hometown of Santiago de Cuba.
And that'll be a week from tomorrow. Jim, thank you for your reporting. And Cuba has been a consistent source of national security concerns for the U.S., from the missile crisis to Elian Gonzalez to questions about our prison in Guantanamo Bay.
For more on all of that and the potential impact of Castro's death on American policy going forward, let's go to Washington now and ABC's chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz. Martha, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan and Paula. For a generation of Americans, the threat from Cuba was real and frightening. A tiny country just off our shores, 90 miles, with a powerful ally. From military disasters to near nuclear war, the 50-year feud with the Fidel Castro-led Cuba was marked by tension and tragedy. The country's alignment with the Soviet Union led to the icy international relations with the U.S. during the Cold War, and the two nations' newfound resentment escalated quickly.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
While his allies agreed to remove their missiles, Castro's animosity towards the U.S. survived. In 1999, the custody battle over Elian Gonzalez playing out as Castro demanded the little boy's return to Cuba. His mother had drowned while escaping with him to the U.S. Armed U.S. agents forcibly removing the boy from his Miami relatives, returning him to his father in Cuba. And there is Guantanamo Bay, the naval base leased by the U.S. from the Castro regime since 1959. After the controversial practice of housing terror suspects, Castro repeatedly denounced the U.S. occupation, saying the land was being used to do America's dirty work. 10 American presidents tried to isolate Castro and hoped for his demise. Then in 2013, this defining moment, President Obama shaking hands with President Raul Castro at Nelson Mandela's funeral, paving the way for renewed diplomatic relations.
This is not merely symbolic. With this change, we will be able to substantially increase our contacts with the Cuban people.
In 2015, the two presidents meeting again as Obama calls for the 53-year-old embargo to finally be lifted. And as for Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, the lease of those 45 square acres does not seem in any danger. It can only be dissolved by mutual agreement.